All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to be looking at Francis of Marchia. Now, he's not a name that everyone knows, even if you are into medieval philosophy.
Yeah, you don't hear his name bandied about as much as, say, Aquinas or Augustine or Scotus.
Right. But he was a pretty important thinker, and he definitely ruffled some feathers in his time.
Yeah.
And he left behind some fascinating ideas that are, well, they're still worth grappling with even today.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you could argue that he was centuries ahead of his time in some ways, especially when it comes to his ideas about science. But yeah, we'll get to that.
We will. But first, who was this guy? Give us the Francis of Marchia origin story.
Okay, so Francis of Marchia, born in Italy, we think somewhere between 1285 and 1290, not exactly sure.
Okay.
He becomes a Franciscan, obviously, rises through the ranks, becomes a respected scholar, theologian, ends up teaching at the University of Paris in the early 1300s.
The University of Paris. That was the intellectual powerhouse of the medieval world, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the place to be if you were a serious thinker. I mean, all the big debates were happening there.
So Marchia is right in the thick of it.
He is. And he doesn't shy away from controversy either. Like a lot of Franciscans at the time, he gets caught up in this whole debate about poverty. Apostolic poverty, to be precise.
Ah, right. The idea that, true followers of Christ should renounce all worldly possessions, right?
Exactly. And Marchia takes a pretty hard line on this. He's siding with what you might call the radical wing of the Franciscan order.
The folks who really wanted to live like, the apostles, like total simplicity.
Precisely. No personal property, no communal property, nothing. And this puts him on a collision course with the Pope, John the XXII.
Ooh, okay. So we've got some serious conflict brewing here.
We do, because the Pope, he's not exactly on board with this whole absolute poverty thing. He thinks it's a little extreme,
So what happens? Does Marchia, back down?
Oh, no, not at all. He doubles down. He and a bunch of other Franciscans, including William of Ockham, they actually publicly challenge the Pope's authority on this.
Whoa, okay, challenging the Pope's authority. That's not a move you make lightly?
Not in the 1300s, no.
So what did they do? Did they write angry letters or something?
Pretty much, yeah. They issued these formal pronouncements, these improbations, arguing that the Pope was actually promoting heresy.
Heresy. That's the nuclear option, isn't it?
Pretty much. I mean, accusing the Pope of heresy, that's basically saying he's undermining the very foundations of the faith.
So I'm guessing this didn't go over well with the Pope.
Not really, no. Marchia ends up having to flee Paris for his own safety. He goes into exile in Munich under the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV.
Wow, so this is a full-blown political and religious crisis.
It was a messy time. And from exile, Marchia continues to write against the Pope, which, doesn't help his situation.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
So what happens to him? Does he, eventually make peace with the Pope?
Well, the ending is a bit of a mystery. We know he was eventually captured, forced to recant his views. But after that, the historical record goes silent. We don't know for sure what happened to him.
So he just, disappears from history? That's kind of amazing.
It is, isn't it? We're left with this enigmatic figure who, for a brief time, shook the foundations of the church and then just vanished. But his ideas, those didn't disappear.
Right. And those ideas are what we're really interested in, right?
Absolutely. Because Marchia wasn't just a rabble-rouser. He was a deep and original thinker. And one of the areas where he really made a mark was in his work on divine foreknowledge and free will.
Ah, the classic problem. If God knows everything that's going to happen, how can we possibly have free will?
Exactly. And Marchia's solution to this problem is, well, it's pretty ingenious. He comes up with this concept called determination de nes.
Okay, determination de ines. Now, I'm going to be honest, that sounds a little intimidating.
It's a bit of a mouthful, I'll admit, but it's actually a pretty intuitive idea once you wrap your head around it.
All right, so try to unwrap it for me then. What's this determination de ines all about?
All right, well, imagine this. You're standing at a crossroads. You can go left or you can go right. Both options are possible, right?
Right.
So you have the potential to choose either path. That's what Marchia calls determination de possibili. The possibility is there, but God, in his infinite knowledge, he already knows which path he will take, even though you haven't made the choice yet.
Okay, so God's looking ahead on the timeline of my life, and he sees me taking the left path, even though I haven't actually made the decision yet.
Exactly, and that's what Marchia calls determination de ines. It's a kind of predetermination, but it doesn't eliminate your free will.
Wait, but how is that possible? How could it be predetermined and I still have free will?
Well, because God's foreknowledge doesn't force you to choose one way or the other. It's more like God sees the choice that you, in your freedom, will inevitably make.
So it's not like God's forcing my hand. It's more like he's just really, really good at predicting what I'm going to do based on like who I am, my personality, my tendencies, all that stuff.
Exactly. And that's the key to Marchia's solution. He's saying God's knowledge of the future is more like a perfect understanding of your dispositions, your inclinations, rather than a rigid script that you're forced to follow.
I think I'm starting to get it. So God knows me so well that he can see what choices I'll make, but I'm still the one making those choices freely.
Precisely. And this idea, this determination, inness, it had a huge impact on later thinkers, too. Especially a guy named John Buridan, who was really influential in the 14th century.
Okay, so Markey is not just coming up with these ideas in a vacuum. He's actually shaping the course of philosophical debate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, really.
Oh, there's more.
Right.
Wait on me. What else did this feather-ruffling Franciscan get up to?
Well, for starters, he wasn't just interested in theology. He was also fascinated by natural philosophy, what we might call science today.
Science, huh? I'm intrigued. What kind of scientific ideas was he exploring?
Well, he was really interested in things like causation, the nature of motion, and he actually came up with some pretty radical ideas about these things, ideas that in some ways anticipated later scientific discoveries by centuries.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. Centuries ahead of his time. Like, what kind of stuff are we talking about?
Well, one of his most interesting ideas is this concept he calls virtus derelicta, which basically translates to abandoned force. He used this to explain like how projectiles move.
Abandoned force. Okay, I'm not sure I follow.
So think about it this way. You throw a ball, right?
Yeah.
Now, according to Aristotle, the dominant thinker at the time, the ball needs a constant force acting on it to keep moving.
Makes sense, I guess.
But Marchia, he disagrees. He says, no, when you throw that ball, you impart a certain force to it, a virtus. And that force, it stays with the ball even after it leaves your hand. It's like the force is abandoned within the object, hence virtus derelicta.
Hold on. So he's saying that the ball carries the force within itself, that it doesn't need some external force to keep it going.
Exactly. And this is a really, really radical idea for the time, because it's starting to sound a lot like the concept of inertia, right?
Yeah, the idea that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. But didn't Newton come up with that, like hundreds of years later?
Exactly. And that's why some scholars think that Marchia was really onto something, that he was, centuries ahead of his time in terms of his understanding of physics.
So this Marchia guy, he's a Franciscan theologian who's challenging the Pope. He's coming up with these innovative ideas about free will. And now he's basically prefiguring Newtonian physics.
And we haven't even gotten to his political theory yet, which is, well, it's just as provocative as everything else he wrote.
Oh, boy. This is a lot to unpack. All right, well, I guess we better keep going then.
So yeah, Marchia's political theory. You said provocative, and I think that's putting it mildly. But what makes it even more interesting is how closely it's tied to his theology, his beliefs about how the world should be, and of course, his own experience butting heads with the Pope.
Yeah, like if you're willing to stand up to the most powerful figure in Christendom over the issue of poverty, you've obviously got some pretty strong convictions about property and power.
Exactly. And that's exactly where Marchia's political theory goes. Like, he flat out rejects the idea that private property is ordained by God.
Whoa, hold on. He's saying private property is not God's will.
Not in the way we usually think about it, no. He sees it as a consequence of the fall, original sin, all that. Like, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they had common dominion over everything. It was only after they messed things up that private property became necessary.
It's like a necessary evil to deal with human greed and selfishness and all that.
Exactly. And he takes this idea pretty far. Like, he argues that the church should be striving to return to that state of original innocence, where everything is held in common, true apostolic poverty.
Which, of course, is what got him into trouble with the Pope in the first place.
Yeah, it all comes full circle, doesn't it? But it's not just about the church for Marchia. His view has implications for, like, all of society.
Yeah.
He believes that the best form of government is one that promotes the common good, ensures that everyone has access to the basics, food, shelter, those sorts of things.
Okay, so he's not just, like, theorizing about angels dancing on pinheads. He's thinking about real-world stuff, social justice, how to create a fairer society.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He's deeply concerned with the ethical dimensions of of political life. And this brings us to another point where he clashes with papal authority. Marchia argues that the Pope's temporal power, his authority over earthly matters, that it's limited.
So like separation of church and state.
Yeah.
Keep the Pope out of politics.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but yeah, he's definitely pushing back against the idea that the Pope has absolute authority in worldly affairs.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
This guy just does not back down, does he?
Not when it comes to his convictions, no. And that's one of the things that makes Marchia so relevant for philosophers today, centuries later. He's forcing us to think about, like, the big questions, the relationship between theology and politics, the nature of property, the limits of power.
It's like he's throwing down a gauntlet, you know, daring us to grapple with these really challenging issues that, well, frankly, we haven't figured out even today.
Exactly. He's not giving us easy answers, but he's making us think. And sometimes I think that's the most valuable thing a philosopher can do.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, okay, we've got this Franciscan who's battling the Pope. He's coming up with these radical ideas about free will. He's like prefiguring Newtonian physics with his Virtus Derelicta. And now we've got this whole political theory that's, well, frankly, it's pretty mind-blowing. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think it's time to circle back to that concept we touched on earlier, determination dell'ness, because it's really the key to understanding a lot of Marchia's thought.
Okay, you're right. It's time to delve back into the mystery of predetermination and free will. All right, so back to determination dell'ness. This is where Marchia really tries to, like, untangle this whole knot of divine foreknowledge and free will, right?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How can God know everything that's going to happen, and yet we still have the freedom to choose? It's a puzzle that's kept philosophers up at night for centuries.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
So how does Marchia even begin to approach this?
Well, he starts by making a distinction. He says there are actually two types of determination.
Okay, two types of determination. Lay it on me. What are they?
So the first one is determination de possibili, which basically just means something is possible.
Okay, so like I could choose to, I don't know, eat a pizza or a salad for dinner. Both options are on the table. Both are possible.
Exactly. Until the moment of choice, both are open possibilities. You're free with respect to the possible. But then there's the second type of determination.
Okay, and that's the dell'ness, right?
You got it. Determination dell'ness.
Yeah.
And this is where things get a little more, well, mind-bending. Because what Marchia is saying is that while you have the potential to choose differently, there's also a certainty about which path you will take.
Wait. Back up a second. How can it be certain if it hasn't happened yet? That sounds like you're saying the future is already fixed.
I know, it's a tricky concept, but Marchia's not saying that your will is being overridden or that you're some kind of puppet. He's saying that God, because he knows everything, he sees the choice that you, in your freedom, will inevitably make.
So it's like God is looking at the timeline of my life, and he sees me picking the pizza, even though right now I'm still debating between the pizza and the salad.
That's a good way to put it. It's not that God is forcing your hand, it's that he sees the choice that flows from, from who you are, your desires, your character, all of that.
Okay, so God's not dictating my actions, but he's got this, like, perfect insight into my dispositions, my tendencies, my pizza-loving nature.
Exactly. And that's the key to Marchia's solution. God's foreknowledge isn't some kind of, like, coercive force. It's more like a perfect understanding of who we are and how we'll choose.
I think I'm starting to get it. So even though it might sound like a contradiction, Marchia is trying to hold on to both divine foreknowledge and human free will.
Precisely. And this idea, it had a ripple effect. It influenced other thinkers, like John Burden, for example.
Yeah, we talked about him a bit earlier. Wasn't he the one who said that even when two options are totally equal, we still have the power to choose?
That's the one. So even in those cases where there's no clear predisposition one way or the other, Burden says our will still has this, like, spontaneous power to break the tie.
Okay, so that's even more emphasis on free will. Like, even when it seems like our choices are arbitrary, we're still the ones calling the shots.
Exactly. And this whole debate, it didn't end with Marchia or Burden. It's still going on today. Philosophers are still trying to figure out how to square divine omniscience with human freedom.
It's a pretty big question, I guess. So, big takeaway for our listeners. Why should they care about this Franciscan who was arguing with the Pope 700 years ago.
Because Marquis' ideas, they show us that these really big questions about free will, about God, about the nature of reality, they're not just abstract. They're not just for philosophers locked away in their ivory towers. These questions, they matter. They've been wrestled with for centuries, and they're still relevant today. They still shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
So Marchia is not just some historical curiosity. He's a voice from the past that can still speak to us in the present.
Exactly. And sometimes, it's those voices from the past, the ones who were wrestling with these big questions centuries ago, that can help us see things in a new light, challenge our assumptions, and maybe even inspire us to think a little bit differently.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Food for thought, you might say.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Francis of Marchia. He was a pretty remarkable figure. And his ideas, well, they're definitely worth pondering. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep diving deep.